Hello, in this video I'll be continuing the series that we've been doing on racial capitalism and intellectual property protections for the LD September-October resolution. In the last video we kind of started off talking a little bit about what I think about like how policy teams can be responding to critiques of racial capitalism, which I think is definitely really important because I think that racial capitalism definitely will be like a core criticism that people are using on this resolution for like the 2 months that it'll be in place. And I definitely think that it's something that even if it's not like a core way for you to have to respond to, i.e. like your circuit doesn't have a lot of people that are reading something closer to racial cap, I definitely think that variations of like the types of arguments that it makes will be on like any type of critical like circuit that exists in whatever region of LD that you're in. So I definitely think that it's worthwhile to really get a good idea of what you're thinking about in terms of like how racial capitalism and intellectual property protections relate to each other, regardless of what side of that debate you're on. If you kind of like, this is your first time kind of like hearing racial capitalism or really hearing the context of racial capitalism on the intellectual property protections topic, I would definitely say to go back and look at some of the stuff that I did in the intro to racial capitalism and intellectual property protections video, because I think some of that lays a lot of the foundation about what I'm thinking for the conversation that we're having here in terms of how racial capitalism specifically kind of answers critical questions about the resolution and why I think it'll be so prominent, but also why I think that it's a particularly potent strategy against most policy teams, which I think warrants being extremely prepared against this argument if you are a policy team under whatever case, because I'm always like one of the people that wants to prepare for like one of like the smaller scenarios, because I think that those are the ones where you're like most likely to be surprised and caught up off your feet. And so I think that being able to prepare for arguments like this that could also like run the entire resolution, but could also just be something that like really good niche teams read is definitely like worth time to prepare for either way. When I'm thinking about some of the stuff that we talked about in the last video and kind of like putting that into what I think about the specific link debate, I think that the link debate that you kind of want to be like pushing against racial capitalism is making arguments about like whether or not they're right about like how they're kind of like deciding the status quo, and whether or not that means that the actual 1AC invested in racial capitalism, or that we just like live in a world of racial capitalism. And I think that dividing the two into like how you kind of want to characterize the link arguments is extremely important, especially when I think that you start to like maybe find mechanisms or locuses for how we talk about the resolution outside of the just the term of like whether or not we're able to articulate the resolution from the perspective of the USFG. I think that when you're kind of like making arguments, or when you're reading an affirmative that's outside of like just a USFG focus or just a United States focus, there's a lot of room to work in terms of being able to bring a history of how like Western values that have come from the United States have created conditions of racial capitalism that spread globally through things like slave trade, through things like native dispossession, that kind of kickstart global economies that like people kind of became like people kind of like needed, or that became necessary in order for like the survival of multiple countries, nations, etc. And I think that the type of arguments that you want to make is the way that those countries respond to that is not like they're responsible to be part of like it's not their responsibility to be part of like the total dismantling of capitalism, or it's not like their like fault if the particular policy that is being like invested in is one that is in nature capitalistic, but rather a question of how can we build an ethic that is about like tearing apart the system that like forces these decisions to always be coercive. And I think that the way in which you kind of think about that allows you to build a lot of pressure into winning that, if that means that the only resolution to that is kicking out of like policy or being unable to access policy, it forces the alternative to hold a lot of weight in terms of not only its ability to resolve racial capitalism, but also to resolve the kind of immediate impacts that are coming from the affirmative. I think that especially because this particular resolution is about intellectual property protection in the context of medicine being such a bare necessity for how people are able to like access like life or death, right? I think it's such an interesting place for you to start this conversation. And I think that by basically centering like why the kind of like access to medicine question is such a necessary and proximate question to like whether or not people are able to even kind of like create or have energy for the kind of resistance projects of the alternative is definitely a place where you can continue to create tension between how the link is trying to draw characterizations of what racial capitalism is in the world, and whether or not the affirmative is actually investing in a system of racial capitalism, which I think is definitely completely different and changes the terms for how you like should be thinking about the debate as a whole. I think that then when you kind of like think about that in the context of how you kind of want to make the perm possible or make the perm a route, I think that a lot of it is basically explaining how the kind of like usage of particular paradigms of political work open up the frame for other alternative like frameworks for how people are able to do resistance at like a non-government level. I think that your argument needs to really make a specific kind of contextualization that takes from a lot of the thesis advice that I did in the last video about telling that specific history of the way in which you're talking about the particular part of the international stage that you're drawing attention to, and making sense of how various vectors vectors of resistance can be created in the context of those countries, surrounding countries that are connected to it or economically interdependent with it, etc. All are places where I think you could have really interesting places for drawing out net benefits of the permutation that raise the specificity for the negative team on all of these terms. And I think that the more specific you get in articulating your affirmative and articulating it outside of the terms that are normatively comfortable for how people enter the debate on a very like Western US based perspective for how they debate, could be a really interesting way for you to be back against a lot of the normative arguments people want to make against racial capitalism and against for racial capitalism and against the permutation, etc. I think that in the context of things like impact comparison, because like I said before, intellectual property protections is really focused on like the question of medicine, you have a lot of material like impacts to really weigh against the consequences of a lot of the stuff that the alternative is going for. I think that there's a lot of things that alternatives need to really be able to touch on in order for them to be able to really win lots of solvency, which is where I think most critiques will be challenged on this resolution, because I feel like a lot of those alternatives have to be doing things like being able to not only win it, they're kind of like reconfiguring the way in which we think about like the international field, but also the way that we're thinking about intellectual property rights, and also the way in which that kind of like renders particular access to bare necessities such as medicine. And I think that these types of like prior considerations to like how we have to think about like the place that all of these factors have in the resolution complicates like how specific and like the lens in which the alternative needs to save like the world and marginalized populations, etc. on its own, which I think can be a really hard responsibility to have the onus of, especially if you're not used to really spending a lot of time like beefing out your alternatives and building them as like really big sustainable arguments. And so I think that when you kind of bring this back to the question of impact comparison, you have a lot of things to say in terms of how the immediate kind of like ways in which policy can kind of be used in order to ameliorate some of the material conditions is kind of like a necessary prerequisite to like allowing the alternative to be able to deal with these more structural concerns that are about the way in which we kind of relate to like being able to refuse racial capitalism on its own terms, rather than attempting to continually create various types of adaptations of the alternative that are able to really deal with all of these various like specific complications that I think the resolution brings to bear. And I think that is like really challenging for a lot of key teams in terms of figuring out just distribution of time as a whole. And so I definitely think it's some place where you want to put a lot of contextualization and specification so that the negative team is forced to do the same in order to really win that their alternative has a lot of ground in the debate. Hopefully this video was helpful, and hopefully you'll tune into the next video that I'll be doing on racial capitalism and intellectual property protections. And yeah, thanks as always for watching.